Today on Off the Clock, we are going to be talking about when employers are required to pay employees for the time they spend traveling for work. The rules are complicated and might surprise you, particularly how they impact employees working remotely. Welcome to Off the Clock, the webcast of employment attorneys at Miller Johnson, where we discuss what is happening in the HR world and provide practical insight and advice. We're going to be talking about something that relates to wage and hour or the Fair Labor Standards Act, and you and I and our listeners know, of course, that is one of your favorite things to talk about.
I will say, could we have a more exciting topic?
The listeners need to buckle up for this one, right? They sure do. And it sounds a little boring on its face, but it's spicier than people may think. I want to talk first, Rebecca, about the difference between paying for mileage and what we're talking about on this podcast today, which is paying employees for the actual time they spend traveling, because I see a lot of confusion from employers and HR folks on that.
This is a great place to start because I've never had a conversation, ever.
Yes.
I've been doing this, 18 years? Mm-hmm. I've never had a conversation with a client about travel time for non-exempt employees. We should make that clear. That's what we're talking about. For non-exempt employees, it involves driving, where this concept of paying for mileage versus hours has not come up.
Yeah, and
right?
isn't kind of a point of confusion.
I always get this question. If I don't bring it up, the client brings it up. So let's separate this out and be done with it once and for all. Paying
well, and I
mileage.
think our listeners may be surprised to hear what you're about to say.
When we say paying for mileage, we all just colloquially say that, right? What that really is a reimbursement from the employer to the employee for gas and wear and tear on their vehicle that they are driving for our business, for our benefit. It is not intended to compensate the person for their work time, right? It's a reimbursement for gas. Just think about gas.
It's like a business expense.
It's a gas reimbursement, and it's not even required.
Well,
so now that
let's be specific about that.
I know
it's not required in Michigan or under federal law.
Right.
Okay.
We do have to check our states on that.
Yeah.
But under federal law, it's not a requirement. And 100% of the time, when I say that to anyone except you,
they're so.
I get
people
the
are so
pushback
surprised.
That say, but the IRS has a rate.
Yeah.
That we have to pay people.
Right.
Per mile.
Right. Yes.
And I say in response,
that's half right. There is a rate.
There's a number out there, and it does change, right? So we also have to keep on top of that. That is the amount the maximum amount you are permitted to pay someone and have it not count as taxable income. Okay. Now that's really getting complicated for people that don't spend their time in taxes. I am one of those people, so we can move on. Hopefully I'm not going to get into what is taxable income and what is not, except to say that IRS rate that a lot of people think is required, it's just the maximum you are allowed to pay in untaxed payments to employees.
Got it. So high level mileage is not required under Michigan law or federal law. However, time spent by employees traveling for work can be considered work time and therefore must be paid as wages and included toward overtime. So let's dive into that.
One more crossover. I'm sorry, I love this topic. Reimbursing someone for the gas is not subtracted or it doesn't count against wages. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, it does not determine whether the travel time is work time or not. Yep. So I have gotten that question. But if we're reimbursing, doesn't that automatically mean it should be paid?
Right.
Or no.
Okay.
Two completely separate. So if you're paying someone's mileage, reimbursing them for their gas, then your supervisors are talking to you about that, say unrelated.
Okay.
Rebecca and Sarah told me to say stop talking unrelated, right? And move on, and then they can call us.
All right, so let's talk then about not mileage, but that travel time piece. Again, in Michigan, there's no special laws about when we have to pay employees for time spent traveling for work. So we're going to focus here on the federal requirements under the Fair Labor Standards Act, right?
Fair Labor Standards Act. And
they're complicated. I will say I see a lot of confusion on this from a lot of employers, and there's good reason for it. The regulations on travel time are very confusing and complicated, but that's okay. They all make sense. We're going to explain it, but it's important to get it right. I think we need to say that because wage and hour mistakes can result in these class action lawsuits. Okay, so it is important to pay attention and get it as right as we possibly can for travel time.
And I'll also say this before we get started. I say this with anytime we're talking about Fair Labor Standards Act stuff, usually, we're talking about the minimum that's required by the law. Yeah. We know lots of organizations that go above and beyond, right? What the law requires. So if you're doing more than what we talk about, you're not doing anything wrong. Okay. You may not have to by law, but if you want to do that for employee engagement, to encourage employees to take jobs that require travel, right? There's lots of reasons to pay people more than what the law requires. All right, well, let's get into what the law...
And to be clear, this is all for non-exempt employees. We're talking about when we have to pay non-exempt employees for time spent traveling, and when it is considered work time, to be clear, not only do we have to pay them at least the minimum wage, but those hours are counted toward overtime as well. It's time spent working just as if they're performing other tasks.
When we're counting up those 40 hours to determine when they start getting the overtime rate,
if it's in two buckets.
It's work time or it's not.
Yep.
It's not. There's not different types of work time that may sometimes not be included towards overtime, right?
Okay.
Okay.
So I think it's helpful to think about travel time in 3 different buckets, okay? The first is what we call the normal commute. That's the easiest. The second is a little bit more complicated. That involves what we call special one-day assignments in another city, out of town. And the third bucket is the most complicated, and that's overnight out-of-town travel. So let's start easy, okay? Here's a softball for you. What about the normal commute? Employees leaving home and driving to their regular workplace and then back home every day. Do we have to pay them for that?
So this is a rule that's easy to say, but can be complicated to apply.
Okay.
Very easy to say. The answer is no.
No, of course not.
You don't have to pay for a normal commute. The question is, what is normal, right? And also, I like to think about it in terms of task to task, right? Not necessarily. So we have to make sure the person has not started working before they commute to work, right? So let's just assume that for the sake of your easy question, we're just gonna take the easiest possible scenario.
Yeah.
No work has been performed. Work is only performed in the office for this individual.
That's what I was
So it's
gonna
very
say.
easy to know.
Your typical, I have home and I have a workplace, like you and I, right? We go from home to a workplace. Yep. That is a normal commute. Now, to your point, it becomes more complicated when employees might have more than one normal workplace, including perhaps their own home.
Or including anywhere we may send them.
Yes.
Let's talk about that for a minute.
Okay.
Very interesting case in upstate New York, refrigerator repair person that repairs commercial refrigeration units in grocery stores. Sometimes his commute is 20 minutes. Sometimes it's 4 hours.
Because it's to get to the refrigerator.
Whatever client has a problem that morning, he gets a message, right, from his employer, from the service company, and that's where he goes. And it was taken all the way up to the Court of Appeals, and the court said, you don't get paid for that drive time. This is someone who performed no work before they left the house. You don't get paid for that drive commute time because for you, that is your normal commute, because your place of work is not a fixed address. Your place of work is wherever we tell you to go that morning. So a normal place of work doesn't have to be an address. It doesn't have to be a fixed location. So that's an interesting case for repair people that think home health nurses, other people, right, that really do go to multiple places throughout the day, week, month, year, right? They don't have an office like you and I. So think about those scenarios.
So let's just pause for a minute because I think there's an important takeaway from that, and that is for employees that don't necessarily have one fixed workplace or have multiple, boy, would it be a good idea to make that clear in writing in an offer letter or job description to say, right, your normal place of work is the Miller Johnson Kalamazoo location, but also Grand Rapids and also Detroit. Those are all your workplaces, and you may be asked to report to any one of those on any given day. And if we say that, then the commute to any one of those could be part of the normal commute.
Correct. We have to be honest and candid, of course. We can't put, a whole list that's not actually true. But it can be one fixed location, it can be more than one fixed locations, or it can be no fixed location.
It can be wherever we tell you that morning. Like the refrigerator repair person.
Is your place of work.
Great idea to have it, because if you're litigating that, having that in writing would be critically important.
That's a deal breaker. I mean, that could prevent the litigation in the first place, frankly, having that in writing.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Well, good. We've gotten through the beginner, step one.
And that was the easy one.
That was the easy one.
Yeah.
Let's now talk about local travel that happens during the workday. So a common example that you and I have addressed would be maybe a home health nurse.
Classic example.
Classic example. Yeah. Most of that workday is spent traveling between different locations. What's the rule there?
The shorthand is all in a day's work gets paid. So what that means is from first task to last task, everything in between, including travel, driving from one home to another, is paid. Now, just like someone who works in a production facility or office, you can give people unpaid meal breaks of a half hour
Rest
or more,
and meal breaks.
assuming that time can be used completely for themselves and they're not interrupted, et cetera. Right. So that's an exception. Query whether you can have more than one of those breaks in a day. My opinion is yes. But just to be candid, in my last few conversations with Department of Labor investigators, the Department of Labor's opinion on that is no. So that would be something to be
only one
argued about.
So they think you can only have one uncompensated meal break per day.
Correct.
Even if the employee has multiple periods of time over half an hour when they're not performing any work, they would say you still have to pay them for those.
Correct. So take the classic example with someone who travels from location to location.
Yeah, sure.
There's an hour between when this visit ends and the next one begins.
But it's only
a 20-minute drive.
Yeah.
And then they are sitting in their car reading a book, or in my case, listening to podcasts, for 40 minutes. The Department of Labor believes you can have one of those in a day, but you can't keep starting and stopping the clock.
We disagree
throughout the day.
But for transparency, that's the current
If you
position.
have that situation and you are not or do not want to pay people for multiple breaks during the day, that's a time to talk to us about how to work through that issue.
So let's take a couple of examples then to play this out, because I think that's really helpful. Let's say I am an employee and I have to drive into my workplace to pick up supplies. First. And from there, I'm out traveling during the workday, calling on customers or patients, right? So in that example, I think, if I'm understanding correctly, that drive from home to my workplace would not have to be paid. That's part of my normal workday.
Correct.
But once I got to my workplace, I started working. Because I picked up the supplies, maybe checked the schedule, et cetera, right? Yeah. And from there, then, it's all in a day's work. That travel time is going to all be paid, unless there's a break, an appropriate break, until I reach the end of my day. And then the drive home from the end of my day, the drive from my last location to home would not be paid.
That is correct.
Am I understanding?
I am understanding that correct. Let me tell you about a very common mistake here, is paying from the time they get to the first client site, patient site, et cetera. and not from the time
Not
they leave
if
the
they
facility.
show up to work, if they go to the workplace.
And so one way to solve that problem is to get your folks whatever they need so that they don't have to
Report to the workplace.
report.
So let's back that up then. Let's say I don't have to go to the workplace and pick up supplies. And instead, I leave my house and I drive to see my first patient. I've not performed any work before I leave. My workday then starts. My normal commute is from home to that first location, just like the refrigerator repair guy.
You got it. Right. So this
Okay.
is a reason, for instance, in the trades, employers may want to allow their employees to take their tools home, for instance.
Yeah.
Right? Instead of having them return to the
Yes.
primary
There's
facility,
reasons
checking
why they
them in.
wouldn't that are
There's pros and
unrelated.
cons.
Yes,
There's
exactly.
certainly pros and cons, but paying for work time is one consideration to think about.
Okay, one more example. What if I'm a home health nurse and I spend the first 2 hours of my morning at home doing some charting, and then I drive straight to see a patient?
We have arguments, but you are risking the fact that a DOL investigator or court may determine that person that you should have gotten paid from the time you started
Because I
charting,
started to work.
and then
My workday
the
has
travel.
started, and
So,
then it's all in a day's
yeah,
work.
again, there's arguments to be made, particularly if we have told you not to do that. So there's two solutions here, really one, but broken down into two. The first thing is, if you don't want that to happen because you don't want to pay people for that initial commute, you have to make it crystal clear in writing in as many places as you can possibly do it, that no work is to be performed before the person arrives at their first site.
Okay.
And then the second piece of that is you have to make that possible for no work to be performed. So for instance, we have employers that we've worked with. Remember I said, there's sometimes downtime when people are on the road. That's the time they're supposed to be doing the charting and everything, right? Like work it out practically. So there is time during the day, particularly downtime, and you're like, I don't want to pay people for listening to a podcast. Fine. Have them do their charting then.
Yeah.
Have them plan their next day's schedule then, right? Have them do tasks you would otherwise be paying them for while they're sitting in their car. Everyone over sitting in the parking lot can pull up a laptop, right?
Yeah.
So one thing under the Fair Labor Standards Act, remember, is we have to get paid when people are working and we knew or should have known they were working.
Yeah.
So if we have told people over and over, you are not to start working, you are not to catch up on charts.
You are not to begin your workday
before you
your
get
first.
to the first patient's home. And we have no way to know they were doing it.
Yeah.
And then we find out later they were. We have a very good argument
That you don't have to
we don't have to
Okay.
pay them
But
retro.
otherwise, setting aside those special facts that take a fair amount of work on the proactivity on the employer side to set up, if that home health nurse is doing that, he or she has a good argument, right? Let's say the employer hasn't said anything about it,
Right.
okay?
And
they
we
start their
know.
charting, and we know
Yes.
they're doing it.
And we know they're doing it.
That they're likely that workday started at home then, and all of the travel from the point they leave home is all in a day's work and has to be paid.
Yes.
Now, see, that's something that I think a lot of employers don't realize because they're used to the normal commute rule. Okay,
Right.
so this is a very important point, I think, for our listeners. And once again, let's take a step back and say out loud and make sure the importance of clearly putting in writing these expectations are especially for these employees who are spending a lot of their workday traveling. It's so important.
It's important to put it in writing, but really, that's HR's role. But to police that it's in writing, the instructions are being given correctly. But I'm telling you, this is really an operations
Yeah.
issue.
The leaders
first,
need to know.
For the operations folks, how do we arrange the workflow
Right.
so that is not necessary?
Right.
And then we inform the employees, this is not necessary, and you are specifically told not to do it.
Because this is an example of, for maybe an employer who has large groups of employees who are doing this work, healthcare, home health. I keep picking on home health, but that's just such a good
In
example.
the trades, it's very common.
This is a
Those are the
class
two
action,
big-
I mean, this
these are the
is
two
a
big
class
ones.
action lawsuit.
Yeah.
This is a good example.
Yep,
Okay.
yep. So structure the days and then clearly communicate.
Okay.
Right, what
So
is
we
allowed and what is
have
not.
so far make clear in writing what the normal workplace is. And also make very clear and put in writing the structure of the workday and when employees are supposed to start and end their workday.
Yep, task to task. I would love for people, so many people say it's first workplace, first stop, first patient
Yes.
to last, but task to task. That's the guideline.
Okay.
All in a day's work.
Now we need to tackle out of town overnight travel.
This is spicy travel.
This is where
This is where it gets fun.
This is where I start to explain this to clients and they just sigh and they say, it just feels so unfair. The deck is stacked against us. How are we supposed to know, understand, and apply these rules? So everyone take a deep breath.
This is where I say, don't shoot the messenger.
Yes, right.
They don't make sense. Don't try to make sense of it.
Okay.
But here we are.
First of all, to be clear, this third category relates to what the DOL calls out-of-town travel.
Right.
What in the world does that mean? Is driving from Kalamazoo to Portage out of town? Is driving from Detroit to Royal Oak out of town?
This is why lawyers get paid.
I know, right?
So it's forget municipal boundaries and county lines. The Department of Labor talks about it as away from your home community.
Oh, that's real helpful. Thanks.
And that usually would be expected to be an overnight trip. So yes, there's gray areas.
Except there's one for an out of town, a special one-day assignment, right?
Right.
Okay. But minimally, it is supposed to be away from the home community.
Away from the home community is the rule.
Well, thanks. That really clarifies things for us.
So call us. Right. Okay.
Okay. Within that, for this out-of-town travel, there are two different buckets. The first one involves a special one-day assignment, and then next we're going to talk about overnight travel.
Right, that's true. I got ahead of myself a minute ago.
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
So
away from home community can be out of overnight or not.
overnight or not.
Yes.
Okay, so out-of-home community, what the Department of Labor calls a special one-day assignment. And what they say is, if an employee ordinarily works at a fixed location, okay, this ties back to the value and importance of defining their workplace. Where's their normal?
Yeah.
But is given what the DOL calls a special one-day assignment in a different town or outside of their home community, then we have to pay them for that. Okay,
For the travel.
For their travel.
This is an important.
For the training, that's a separate issue, and we're not going to get into it right now. But for the travel time, so I commonly see this come up maybe for training, special trainings, especially right after hire, right? We've hired
orientation type of
You're
training.
normally going to work in Kalamazoo, but come to Grand Rapids for the week of corporate training. Okay?
Yep.
Those would all be special one-day assignments, and we must pay employees for the travel time to do that.
I see it a lot with some one-day seminars and third-party training and that sort of thing. When we determine that, and again, we're not talking about that in this podcast, but when we go through the framework to decide whether that training is paid or not, we determine it should be paid work time, then all the regular travel time rules apply, right? And if it's a special one-day assignment, you pay for that.
It could also be a business that has multiple locations, and I usually work at the location in Kalamazoo, but there's a need for me to fill in up in Grand Rapids, so I'm gonna be doing. We have to pay non-exempt employees for that travel time. This comes as a surprise to many employers, to many HR folks, and again, class action lawsuit. If this is a practice, if this is a requirement that includes lots of employees or is a regular practice, our listeners should be paying attention and thinking about what they need to do to fix that.
And focus on the word special.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is not someone who's, again, one of their regular places of work might be Grand Rapids, even though they work the other days in Detroit, et cetera. Special means special, right? Non-routine, right? It doesn't mean it can't be planned in advance, but not routine, out of the normal course, right? It's the way I think about it, just in common, the way I actually talk is this is not what the person signed up for when they took the job. I thought I was going to be working in Detroit, right? And now today, once a year, I have to go fill in for someone in Grand Rapids because there's a flu outbreak. Well, that's not what I signed up for. It was a commute to Grand Rapids.
That's a good way to look
Focus
at it.
on the word special.
Are we ready for overnight travel?
I'm wanting to get there this whole time.
This is the worst.
This is the best.
This
is where we provide the most value because no one understands it.
So when I explain overnight travel, I first separate whether the employee will be a passenger for the travel or whether they have to drive themselves. Okay?
Yep.
Because the rules are different.
Yep.
If they're just a passenger, whether it be in a car or an airplane or a train, it doesn't matter, the vehicle, they're just a passenger so that they could do something else, right? And they're not working. They're not otherwise performing work.
Not performing other duties other than travel.
Correct.
Right.
If they're just a passenger, the rule is, I'm going to make you say it because in my opinion, it's so dumb that I don't like to say it. You say it. You tell our audience what the rule is.
First, you have to determine what the employee's normal scheduled work hours are.
Yes.
Let's just say 7A to 3P. Then you have to apply that to all 7 days, even if the person is not normally scheduled to work all 7 days.
Okay.
So where employers get understandably really mixed up is they see the rule, right, through AI or Google or whatever, it says their normal schedule, right? But the normal that's not actually accurate.
It can be on any
It's the
day.
hours of the day that they normally work, but applied across all 7 days.
Okay.
And if travel occurs during those hours, let's say 7A to 3P, on any day of the week, it is paid.
Okay. So I am on a flight on a Sunday afternoon over hours when I would normally work on Monday through Friday.
Yeah.
Even though I'm just a passenger,
Yep.
I'm not performing any work.
10 to 3 flight.
My
Yep.
employer has to pay me for all of that time sitting on the airplane.
Correct. Now, the follow-up question I always get is, can we require employees to only fly, let's say the 7A to 3P employee, can we require their travel to be after regular work hours so we don't
Sure.
have to pay them? The answer is yes, but that's an employee relationship.
Yeah.
Legally,
Red eyes only.
no problem. And that's where we get back to where we started at the beginning. We're telling you the minimum.
Got it.
You may want
Got
to do more than that to incentivize people to take jobs that require
Okay.
travel.
So then, thank you. Let's go back to the employee having to drive themselves for the travel. That is always working time.
It's always working time. Driving is work.
Interesting.
You can't, another way to think about it for those that are
Even
like,
if you're
really?
listening to a podcast.
Yeah, because you can't really use the time for your own purposes. You can't be at your kids', you can't be when you're a passenger on a plane anyway. This is where the rules stop making sense. But driving is considered an activity.
That
It's
has
not
to be
passive.
paid. So doesn't,
it
if
should be
it's out of town overnight travel, if the employee has to drive themselves, that is always work time, doesn't matter when it occurs, doesn't matter what hours. And I know if the employee is doing it driving by choice, and it was an option for them to instead be a passenger, there are times when that's not required. So
Then
I'll
you
just
don't
say
have
that out loud. I don't think
Yeah.
we need to dive too deep into
We
that.
do not. There are lots of occasions where
that's
flight
very rare.
schedules, et cetera, and someone wants to drive
So,
to
yes.
get back earlier.
And employers could require carpooling if multiple employees are going or driving for out-of-town travel. We could require carpooling to avoid paying every single one of those employees to drive their own vehicle if you wanted to.
Quick interjection, and then I'm not sure if people want us to keep talking about this, but we talked at the beginning about that mileage reimbursement. An area here I see a lot of confusion on almost always when I have conversations is per diems. A lot of clients will give employees who travel a per diem, right, to account for meals, hotel, whatever it is, while they're traveling. That does not relate to whether the travel time itself counts as work hours that need to
Nor
be
is
paid
it
and
subtractable from
counts
it.
towards overtime, okay?
Yep.
So consider per diems just like the IRS gas reimbursement.
Yep.
Separate payment issue completely.
Correct.
Okay. I just always get that question, so I want to make that clear.
Well, let's talk for a second about just the takeaways here. We've gotten through all the rules. So the takeaways are, to me, the takeaways are how it's so important to, number one, make clear what an employee's home work location or locations are.
What their normal
place of work is.
Yes.
And what prompts the beginning and end of their workday, right? Where and when they're allowed to do that.
Yep.
Critically important to have both of those in writing. And I would say also very important to have a clear travel time, either a written policy or an HR protocol, so that everybody's on the same page. And then finally, leaders, supervisors need to understand these rules, because I think our listeners, the HR folks, may now know what's supposed to be paid and what's not supposed to be paid, but it may not be applied in practice by leaders.
The leaders are the weak point. Sorry, supervisors, but you are the weak point. Because you're the ones that approve the pay cards, right, and the payroll. So they're the ones who say, no, I'm not. That doesn't count, or this does. And they're the ones that might call someone before they head out for their first appointment to say, can you just do this first, et cetera.
All right.
So
Thank
it
you
was
for
fun,
your
right?
insight and knowledge. This was fun.
Fair Labor Standards Act can be fun.
Yeah.
It's not always fun, but today was fun.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.